Welcome to the Giberson Glass Studio video introduction. Okay, so this case is building on the first case, and that you're going to be looking again at how to price your products. So what's an appropriate strategy for pricing your products in order for you to generate a profit? There's a couple of interesting differences between the first case and this case, one of which has to deal with capacity. In this case, we are now at full capacity. In fact, we have a backlog of orders. So when you're at full capacity, what you then need to turn your attention to is maximizing your potential. So in other words, if you've got limited resources in which to work with and you're at full capacity, you want to make the most per unit of resource. And in this case, we're dealing with a small company that makes glass products. So he's a small business, sole proprietor, owner-operator, and his business is struggling. So he really needs some assistance in helping to figure out how to price his product lines. So that's a key difference. He is at full capacity, and you've got to learn how to maximize limited resources. The potential of those limited resources. And the other difference is in the last case we dealt with one product, which helped us to simplify our analysis and focus just on cost behavior, fixed versus variable costing. In this case you have multiple products to deal with, and so you've got to figure out how to allocate those costs in appropriate ways to help you analyze each product line and then determine what it should be priced at to at least break even. Because as of right now, this company is generating a loss. So it'd be good for us to know what's at least the price we need to charge to break even, and then beyond that, how can we make decisions that would then create a profit potential? Because it's not enough to just break even. Companies need to replace assets and they need profits to be able to do that. Or they may want to grow and hire more employees. If he's got a backlog of orders, you might want to expand to include another employee to help in the production of the units to meet that demand. Certainly seems like a viable option. Would just require a little bit of restructuring. So those are some of the issues you're going to be grappling with in this case. When I set up the template for this one, I did a lot of the legwork, let's say, for you. So that it's structured to guide you through the process, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the reason for the presentation at the end of the week is to get you to go back and try to unravel, okay, how was this set up? Why was it set up this way? What inputs did I use? What was relevant to me in driving the decisions? Because all too often what can happen if I give you too much help with the Excel, you just kind of crunch it out and don't really grasp what it would take to put that together in the real world. So I do want you to reflect on that. All right, so let's look at some of the data that's in the case. I always like to do that in the video recording. On page 10 of the case, you have at the top of the page, Table 1, which walks you through what the various costs are in the materials. So this would be your material costs, which are, remember, a variable cost. And then on page 11, what you see is the weight per piece. So you probably will end up calculating the cost per pound, and then you'll have to roll out the number of pounds per piece to get the relative cost per piece. So that's why you need that, and that's where you're headed with that. And then on page 12, you have the amount of time that the owner is spending on the units. So you notice there's hot time and cold time, and when you read the case, you'll pick up on this too. But you've got to add those two pieces together to get the total amount of time it takes to make one of those units. And then you got to do the same thing with the average weekly production, which is in the last two columns. You got to add the firsts and the seconds together. So again, when you read the case, you'll pick up on that. So to get the total number of units for patterned glass, for an example, you'd add 18 in one to get 19 units sold in an average week. All right, and then down at the bottom of page 12 is the price that you're currently charging per unit. He's charging per unit, current list price. And then moving on to page 14, you're given the average monthly operating costs, which is very common, right? We generally break down our accounting into months, or we look at the monthly results, and oftentimes the bills that we pay are sent to us monthly. So utility bills, phone bills, rent bills, those kinds of things are paid monthly. So very common for us to structure things into a monthly organization. And then on the last page of the case, you see the balance sheet for September 1st. So it's kind of like your beginning balance sheet, your starting point of what's in various accounts, including a truck loan. And so in this case, I show you how to do a loan amortization. So it's a schedule that shows how each payment is broken down into interest and principal so that you can see where you stand or what the balance on the loan is after any given payment. Okay, so it's not necessarily a payoff amount because you might have accumulated interest on days leading up to the payment, because payments are always in arrears on mortgages and car loans, unlike rent, which is usually paid in advance. Installment loans and mortgages are in arrears. And so your payoff amount is always going to include some accumulated interest since the last payment. But it does give you a rough idea, or an exact idea actually, of where you stand or what you owe as soon as you make that payment, assuming that you make it exactly on the date that it's due. All right, so you'll look at that, and again, I've done that for you. I've done the amortization because I know you have a limited amount of time to work on this stuff, but when you get to the presentation, I will be looking for you to kind of unpackage that and explain what it is, right? Because it's kind of one of the background things that wasn't given in the case, but that I provided in the template. All right, so an additional challenge you're going to face in this case is I ask you to create an annual income statement, and many of the items in the case are given either on a per unit basis or on a monthly basis. As you see on page 14, those are on a monthly basis. So you're going to have the additional challenge of being able to pull it all together for a year. And this company operates 40 weeks of a year. The rest of the time he's out at trade shows selling his wares, or he takes a vacation. So you got to make those kinds of adjustments in order to figure out the income for the year, or in this case, the loss. And I do coach you through that in the Excel template, so you should be fine in getting those answers. But you'll notice there's a little bit of that manipulation going on where you have to multiply either by number of weeks in a particular period or by the number of months. All right, other things that I want to point out. Okay, so just a couple more things, and then I have these all in a list on a future slide that's coming up here. You're going to be dealing with productivity ratios in this case, which is unique. One of which would be the waste of the materials. So he creates this batch size that you might want to consider in one of your final recommendations. And he also, you want to consider his productivity and labor time, because labor is really the constraining resource here. He doesn't have enough time to meet the demand that is incurred, and it's partially driven by how much time he spends in production and how much time he spends doing other things. So you may decide one of your recommendations should include another employee, but I'll let you all, grapple with that. So just to summarize some of the learning objectives, you'll be working with this whole idea of capacity constraint. You'll be working on the idea, like I said earlier, you got to figure out what price you should charge to at least break even, to get them there, see if that's even achievable. Right? You're going to also talk or look at the structure So many of his costs are committed costs, fixed costs. And so when you have high fixed costs, your break-even point is generally higher, meaning that it's going to take a longer period of time for you to break even. So if you think about a year as being a measure of performance, so how did we do this year or last year, and we're comparing, you want to know how many months of the year does it take for you to get to break even. So much better to get to break even at 4 months, so let's say April, end of April, as opposed to 8 months, right, end of August, before you actually start turning a profit. Especially when you consider things like what's going on right now with the pandemic and people having business interruption. Right? If it takes you that long to get to break even, 8 months, and you go through a period of time when you're not operating at all early in the year, that's going to have a significant impact on whether or not you make any money this year. So very important to understand your cost structure and when and how you get to break even. Sooner is obviously better, but there's a trade-off to that. So I'm going to make sure this is clear. This high fixed cost structure implies that break-even point would be much later, but here's the benefit. So that's the drawback. The benefit is once you reach break-even, you start to really make a lot of money very quickly because you've covered your fixed costs. Your variable costs are quite small as your high fixed cost structure. So your variable costs are a small component of total costs, which means that almost every dollar in revenue is going to go right to the bottom line after break-even point. And you start making a lot of profit very quickly, as opposed to the opposite of that, where you have a high variable cost structure. Perhaps you get to break-even point early in the year, after 4 months, let's say, but then you don't make as much per unit because you have a higher variable cost. So not as much of the revenue is going to go down to the bottom line after you reach break-even point because you have a high variable cost percentage. So that's some of the things you need to think about. Lots of new things for you to grapple and consider and inform your recommendations, which is the third piece there. So I'm going to be looking for you to make recommendations as a team to improve their profitability, and that might come packaged in several different ways. So I'm hoping to see some diversity in your answers in different ways that they could improve their profitability. All right, so this is just a summary of the case. It's also in the workbook, but just a couple of things I'll point out one more time. So we have this financial concern. We also know he's at capacity, he's got a backlog of orders. He also understands his prices are too low and he needs some help, right? So let me keep moving here. This was that list I promised you. So I guess there's only one more thing I wanted to say because I already talked about all this other stuff. About depreciation here, make sure you're using the straight line method, which means you take the cost of the asset you're going to depreciate and divide by the number of years. And that gives you the amount of expense that you're going to write off as a cost for that year. So again, straight line method. And then some of the challenges, I think I already talked about some of these as well, is the spreadsheet. It's a fairly complicated setup, but I've done a lot of the, I call it automatic fills for you. So you'll be able to work your way through it and reach the checkpoints, I hope, and make those recommendations to create a more profitable model. So that's about all I had to say about it. Good luck getting it started. If you have any questions, let me know. Okay.